This is part 2 of the role of government to promote innovation. And so in part 1, we discussed what was creativity and how did it start. And so when we think of creativity, we think of thinking new things. And so at the university level, we could use the word discovery, because universities and research institutions, what they do is by taking funding, using funding to come up with knowledge, come up with new discoveries. So that's the first part we discussed on how governments can play a role to promote innovation. And so what we ended with, the impact of discovery. So we saw the output was knowledge, so there was discovery. Now the next part, we want to make sure that knowledge makes it into the marketplace. And so in the life of this country, in terms of innovation, when we think of innovation, when we think of entrepreneurship, 1980 is a pivotal year, because when you look at startups before 1980 and after 1980, it's almost two different worlds. Because prior to 1980, the title or ownership to any invention created using federal funding was owned by the U.S. government. So outlined, as I said, that when you think of a research institution, when you think of a university, they receive government funding, so the output is knowledge, but that knowledge was owned by the U.S. government. And so the government would have the title, would have the right, and the government would grant non-exclusive license to patents that came out of that research. Now just think of that, right? So the government owned this, would fund the research, would take the research, but would only give you a non-exclusive right to a patent. Now, if I'm an inventor, why would I pay money for a non-exclusive right for a patent? The problem with a non-exclusive right is that it's non-exclusive. And so because you've paid for a non-exclusive, then that means that you're going to invest capital and time and know-how to create a product or a service that you're going to introduce into the marketplace. But because you have a non-exclusive right, your competitor or anyone can see what you've done and approach the U.S. government and ask them for also a non-exclusive right, for a non-exclusive license. So it wasn't a good business move for anyone to get a non-exclusive. So what happened is that there were over 28,000 patents owned by the U.S. government, but less than 4% of those patents were licensed, because once again, you could only get a non-exclusive right. So that's why we find that in 1980, there was something called the Bayh-Dole Act. The Bayh-Dole, these were two senators, Senator Bayh, Senator Dole. Senator Bayh was from Indiana, Senator Dole was from Kansas, and they came together to promote, they authored some legislation which for the first time gave the title or ownership to inventions or knowledge that was funded by the U.S. government to the persons who actually did the research. So a researcher at an institution, at a university could have a title, could have an exclusive rights to that invention, and then they could either license that invention exclusively to a company, or they could create a company on their own. And so one organization that was very aggressive in doing this was the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, WARF. WARF, although it was started in 1924, and it made its name because it created warfarin or used technologies that enable vitamin D to be put in milk and cheese, because at that time there was a problem with rickets, and especially those of us who live in northern climates where in the wintertime, there's very little sun. If you stayed inside enough, too long and not get the right amount of vitamin D, then you could have a problem with rickets. So it was recognized that vitamin D, that if you fortified food with vitamin D, that helped to prevent the onset of rickets. But that technology, which was licensed, which was funded to a large extent by the U.S. government, wasn't licensed to the inventor. But in 1980, that all changed, and so with the Bayh-Dole Act, we were able to, for the first time, see that university research was able to make its way into the marketplace. And so that's why that if you look at the companies that have been formed since 1980, it's a who's who list. And many of those companies, especially in technology, whether it's in bio or in tech, could have, or even in software, could have obtained their technology from university research. So what the slide shows is that now we have moved from discovery, and after discovery, then we could go to small business. Now, once you create a company, and all companies that start out small, whether you're a startup, I consider you a small business because you're small. You're under 500 employees. So now you start out small, but there are many ways that you can go. And so now you have the technology, now you may have some people in place, you have license, but how do you cross what's called the Valley of Death? Now, the Valley of Death is known as the place where technology and companies go to die because it takes money to bring a product to the marketplace. And unless you're able to cross what we call that chasm of death, then you die. And so that's why when we look at development, there's funding that is needed. And so what the U.S. government did with the National Science Foundation, they created in 1981 a program called the Small Business Innovation Research Program, SBIR. I was fortunate to be a program manager, not in 1981, many years after that, as part of this program. And this program gave seed funding to businesses or to technology companies that may be licensed from universities to help them to cross what's called the Valley of Death. And so once you can cross that Valley of Death, then there are those who are on the other side, the investors or industry, who will work with these companies to bring the product to the marketplace. And so, but there was also another program most recently that has helped to accelerate that innovation, from creativity to bring the innovation to the marketplace. There's something called the NSF I-Corps program. This program is unique because what it did also, because it recognized that many technologies or services are not really companies. And so there was, I believe, a fallacy that for a long time we believed that that to start a company, to create something for the marketplace, is that you write a good business plan. You write a good business plan with 5-year projections that's going to make all this money, and that was entrepreneurship, that was creativity, that was innovation. Well, that's just plain wrong, because many times you don't know whether or not the technology, if there's a market for the technology. You don't know enough to really write a good business plan. So what the I-Corps program did is that it, for the first time, it would select a number of projects. But what the team had to do, that before they weren't charged to write a business plan because we didn't know whether or not the company was a company or a product or what type of service. So they would have to call about 100 companies. They would have to go to the marketplace and call companies, and it forced the entrepreneur, it forced the scientist, it forced the business person to get intel or get data from the marketplace. And by doing that, you understood who was the competition, who was the customer, what is the price point, what is the form factor, and whether or not you have something that would be embraced. And after you were able to do that, then you could really start to make the case, okay, now I have enough intel, I have enough data, one, to raise funding, but also now I can put together business plan or something that says there is something more to that. But that's why it's important when you think of innovation that we have to do some market intel. You have to know who the customer is. You have to know who the competitor is. You have to know how do you fit into the supply chain. And so that's why you have to be able to call and to make sure that you are aware of what's going on. Now, when you think of the technology adoption life cycle, this is a great chart here. It's based upon the book Crossing the Chasm by Geoffrey Moore, who wrote a great book that talked about the fact that when you introduce technologies into the marketplace, there are 5 different groups that will look at your technology. There are the innovators. There are those who embrace new things, embrace new technologies. Anything that's new, they're going to jump on it. And then there are those who are what we call the early adopters, that if you have something, they'll at least adopt it and they'll at least try it. But then there are those who are the early majority. Those are large companies who will say, well, okay, I looked at this technology. It looks like it's feasible. It looks like it works. I'll take a look at it. But then there's the other group. It's called the late majority. They're technology agnostic, or they are pessimists. They don't want to have anything new. They're very conservative. They will be the last to adopt. They'll be one of the last to adopt their technology. And then they're the laggards. They're not going to be in line to buy the latest iPhone or the latest Samsung. They're going to wait to see to make sure that all the bugs have been have been found out before they embrace the technology. And this is very, very important, because if you are looking to sell to a laggard and you're a startup company, then that's not going to be a good fit, because by definition, they're a laggard. They're not going to buy your technology. That's why it's important to identify who are the innovators, who are the early adopters. They're the ones, they're the visionaries. They will work with you. And that's why seeing the business model canvas, and it goes back to what I said about the I-Corps program. This is the business model canvas is unique in terms of when we look at lean startup, in terms of making sure that we know the 9 categories that we really need to get data on before we can write a credible business plan, or to even say whether or not we have a business. This is something that I've made use of, and I think this is something that adds to the innovation process. And so as we wind down this presentation, and as we talk about the role of government to promote innovation, I look at government in 3 buckets, right? That the role of government is to correct market failures. And by doing this, one is to invest in science. So we talk about discovery. So pure and applied, in early stage applied research. That's a role that government can play. Also, human capital comes out of this as well. Enabling legislation and regulation, that's very, very important. Government has the power to regulate, and so to make the rules. The rules has to be clear, transparent, and predictable for us, for the players to make sure that they compete. Science and innovation infrastructure. We must have the infrastructure that we can build these companies and build these technologies so that they can grow and thrive. Education and skills. We have to have the skill set necessary to create a culture or create a demographics that can execute and can build on the skills needed for the science. Create incentive for business investments. This is to compensate technological and financial risks for businesses, grants, and fiscal incentive. Knowledge transfer. That's very, very important. It goes back to discovery. Many times it's not so much technology transfer, it's knowledge transfer. When we think of innovation, it's about knowledge transfer, it's about sharing your knowledge with others. But once again, we need to have a strong patent system that if I share the knowledge with you, I have to be protected for a limited period of time so that I can monetize that invention. And invest in underpinning infrastructure. We have to have standards. We have to have ways to communicate. That if those of you who have different type of cell phones or different type of technologies, you want to be able to make sure your technology works. Not only their grandfather with previous technology, but it can work with other technologies, that you're not locked into having to work with one provider or one company. And so that's why we have to make sure we have the standard bodies that work, and intellectual property. I think I covered that already in terms of making sure we have a credible patent system that works. And so I just want to thank you. This is going to be the end of phase part 2. And so in part 1, just as a recap, we talk about creativity is about thinking in a new way. It's about discovery. How do we discover? How do we create new ways of thinking? And that's what creativity does. Now, when we think of innovation, and this is the second part that we just wrapped up, we think about doing things in a new way. So one is about thinking, one is about doing. And so that's how we bring them all together to create a system that is sustainable and is novel. And so I just want to thank you again, and I look forward to working with you. Thank you.